Martyn, you hosted a seminar last night at the JSE, 165 delegates coming to that seminar. Lots of interest in South Africa as one of the BRIC members.
There's been a lot of enthusiasm the last week or so, particularly in light of the summit taking place in South China. I think the question last night was how does South African business leverage the opportunity that perhaps the very politically enabling environment that's been created by politicians. Now the question is, how does SA business step into this, start to reposition and fully take advantage of this realignment, if you will, of SA's commercial relationships towards emerging markets, best represented by the BRICS.
Do you see this as a politically enabling environment for businesses, Peter?
I think it is partly, but as I said last night, it's really all about, in my view, all about resources, because obviously South Africa is a springboard into Africa. It's Africa's biggest economy. If you look at GDP, with about $370 billion, which is, by BRIC standards quite low, by African standards it's very high. It's the country with the biggest amount of infrastructure, huge resources, $2.5 trillion, as you know, billion dollars according to Citibank, and it's really a foothold into the continent for BRIC countries, and particularly for China.
Well, we know there are other members of the BRICS who are also rich in resources, Brazil, Russia also. Are we going to be competing with them for that Chinese markets? Is China going to be competing with us also for that trade?
I think the key thing here is that if you strip out the political rhetoric, our politicians, we're all on the same political page almost, but at the same time, companies from BRIC economies are also our greatest competitors in our own region. What is our hinterland neighborhood economy from South African perspective? Increasingly, we're seeing competition come particularly from the likes of the Chinese, the Indians and Brazilians. You see even in Metarex now, Vale, Brazilian mining major company bidding for Metarex, competing with a Chinese counterbidder, inflating, pushing up the cost of commodity assets, as Peter said, in this part of the world. So I think it's a question of how do we balance do we compete, do we collaborate, how do we align the interests perhaps of SA Inc. with the interests of other BRIC companies or players, particularly state capitalist players. I'm talking particularly here about China and Brazil, in effectively what is our own economic neighborhood.
Also, how about creating a regulatory environment that's conducive to the investment that we might expect as a result of this? We had the Trade and Industry Minister, Martyn Davies, yesterday saying he expected $115 billion of investment into South Africa over the next 3 years, 115 billion rand over the next 3 years. But we have seen recently lots of perhaps adverse reactions to some of that investment, where we had Kansai coming in for Free World, we have Walmart coming in for Massmart, and to some extent the competition authorities standing in the way of mergers like this. Do we need to change our regulatory environments if we are going to anticipate more investment here?
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of double speak going on, because the government on the one hand is talking about trying to create an environment for foreign direct investment, clearly wants to have foreign direct investment into South Africa because of the multiplier effect of that on job creation, employment, economic growth and so on. The problem is that it is a bit inconsistent. You take the Walmart example, for one thing. Here's the world's biggest retailer wanting to come into the country, apparently being blocked, in inverted commas, by the Department of Trade and Industry through its representations to the Competition Tribunal on that merger. The same thing, as you mentioned, with Free World and Kansai, where again the government appears to be fairly equivocal about whether or not they want them in the country, because of the impact that might have on IPAP, the industrialization program of the Department of Trade and Industry. But I think government does need to send out a consistent message about foreign direct investment and creating the right regulatory environment for investment, where, in fact, if you look at the mining industry, which obviously I follow quite closely, the opposite's been happening. I mean, recently there have been some attempts to fix the regulatory environment by the Department of Mineral Resources, but certainly in the past year, the regulatory environments look very uncertain.
What's your view on that, Martyn? Do you think we're doing enough to attract that investment, and that investment that is looking at South Africa as the gateway to Africa?
I think there's two things here. Firstly, as Peter said, a more coherent position perhaps in terms of our respective government departments, trade union particularly, around motivating, attracting and promoting SA as being an investment-friendly destination, which I think there's questions being raised about that. And the second point, I think, is around how do, South Africa is the smallest member of BRICS economies. We're a mid-sized Chinese province, if you will, a mid-sized Indian state. What we need to do to as Peter said earlier, to truly act as a springboard for a region is to promote region integration in our own region. SADC is 250, 260 million odd people. We're bigger than Brazil, we're bigger than Russia, we're even bigger than Indonesia, another perhaps candidate member for a BRIC sort of association. So if we can start to promote ourselves as a true regional market of 250 million people, that is a lot more attractive. But to do that, it's about integration firstly, and secondly, it's about regulatory environment, about streamlining these regulations and having a far more coherent, clear message that we send out to investors, particularly with BRICS.
Martyn, if we are being seen as a proxy for Africa in our admission to the BRICS grouping, do we have to put Africa or regional interests ahead of our own interests within this grouping?
Well, I think ultimately we'll always speak of a national interest, I hope, rather than, we don't have a mandate to speak on behalf of a continent from the AU or any regional organisation. But I'm hoping, and I think it's fairly obvious, that South Africa will always largely talk, maybe not with a mandate, but at the very least a pro-African voice at these meetings. And if BRICS is becoming, as it becomes more institutionalized, will become a counterweight to the G7. The G7 obviously represents, should we say, vested political economic interests of a traditional first world. The BRICS increasingly will represent the interests of the emerging developing world. So BRICS is, I think it'll be very difficult to add more letters to BRICS and for it to make sense. How do you add T Turkey or M Mexico or K Korea into the BRICS acronym? So it'll start to become what I'm calling already not BRICS but the E5, the emerging five versus the G7. That could be the E6, the E7 ultimately. But I think it's a question of that emerging market grouping that BRICS has to have an African member to be fully representative of 1 billion people on this continent, and that's what it now has of South Africa's inclusion.
Well, regulatory challenges aside, Peter, how do South African businesses position themselves if they do want to benefit to the maximum from this new grouping?
Well, I think it's a challenge to them because obviously the South African businesses are going to be competing with the likes of Vale in Brazil, Chinese state-owned enterprises, Indian power companies and mining companies. But clearly, in an African context, South African business has so far done pretty well. If you look at retailers and so on who've gone into Africa, banks that are going into Nigeria and so on, where we've actually shown in a sense the way. So South African business does know the continent well, and I think does start with that advantage. But I think the fact that South Africa's now become a member of the BRICS, I think could well be a catalyst for trade liberalisation, because I think that is very important in terms of creating the right enabling regulatory environment, both in the issue Martyn was talking about in terms of making SADC a proper common market, which it isn't at the moment. The aspiration is to be that, but that has not happened. But secondly, within BRICS itself, to try and create a free trade grouping amongst BRIC countries, I think that would make a very big difference and actually make the whole organisation a lot more salient and relevant.